in some events, the last item on the day is the main event. That's not true in this case because all of the panels were extremely important, but this one was my panel. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the main event of the evening. Stefano already gave a discussion on the topic of defining open source AI, and you can see it's an extremely complicated and ongoing topic. We won't go into that topic on this panel. If people do want more about that, then at FOSDEM there's plenty of presentations. There's a panel that's on 1:30 on Saturday, and FSF has an announcement at 11 o'clock on Sunday in the K building. This panel here is about progress, and it's about progress in focusing on two questions. One is, how do we ensure that free software projects and companies will choose to stay and grow in Europe? And second is, how do we ensure that AI companies are confident and encouraged to release their models as free software, as open source? Or how do they get involved in existing projects? So maybe to summarize, it would be more free and open source AI in Europe for Europe. We had an awful lot of requests for people wanting to be on this panel, so I hope you like the selection we made. I will quickly introduce the panelists we have. So the first panelist is Alexandra. He's a technology specialist in AI in the EU's AI office, which was created in 2024 by the AI Act. Beside him, we have Lucie-Aimée, and she is an EU policy lead and applied researcher at Hugging Face. So Hugging Face is both a platform for open source developers to share their models and data sets for AI, and it's also a community of people who develop and use AI models or want to learn about them. And so Hugging Face also developed their own AI models and software. Beside her, we have Alexandra Geese, who is an elected member of the European Parliament. She's from Germany, and she's in the Greens group of the Parliament. And then at the end, we have Yann Lechelle, who is a CEO and co-founder of Probable, an open source AI company based on an asset that has been downloaded 2.2 billion times. The company has been designed to strengthen European sovereignty. So, Yann, if I can start with you. With the AI Act being the first type of market regulation in this domain, can you give us an overview on how businesses feel, what the level of confidence or readiness or even awareness is with this new regulatory situation?
Thank you for the question, the first question, which is a tough one. The answer is that businesses are lost in so many ways. In other words, AI in the current form, generative AI in particular, has stunned the world. But we cannot talk about AI without talking about software. We cannot talk about software without talking about the full stack. And the full stack is something that we as Europeans have neglected for decades. And so, again, this one paper called All You Need Is Attention is a paper produced by a team at Google. They invested a lot of capital and resources to get to that point, but then they also had the resources to stimulate all of that. But it's not Google that actually came up with ChatGPT. It's another company which itself was super well funded, having access to tremendous amount of power. And so that created the conditions to shock the world. And we were shocked because for the first time ever, the human species, which differentiates itself from the animal realm, is able to speak and handle language. And for the first time, we've been threatened as a species, and society and businesses, about this ability to manipulate language in a way that no human is capable of doing, even though there are hallucinations. Humans do that as well. So this object came to us by surprise. Scientists had an idea that this was coming, but it came to us. It came to us as a very tangible way. And so businesses are coping. They've been coping since ChatGPT, but nations have been coping as well, trying to catch up. And everyone was focusing on GPUs, right? But GPUs consolidate in the cloud. But since cloud providers are the same major three in the first tier, namely AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud Platform, these platforms tend to consolidate and attract everyone who wants to do anything with Gen AI and creating models. So that became the first thing. Do we accept even more dependency, or do we try to buy GPUs? But then it turned out that the big buyers are creating a delay in supply, so it's difficult to acquire those GPUs. And they said, okay, no, we're just going to rent it out, software as a service. OpenAI, which by the way is no longer open, provider of closed software as a service. And then others created a disruption. And this is where it gets interesting. So I'm totally against Meta's reaction, which was to unleash, I'm not going to say open, unleash the beast. They created Llama 2, gave it to the world in a way that is somewhat open. Somewhat open. And so people have been able to use this for free to some degree. But it's costly, and it's also a moving target. So companies are lost. Do I need to keep refreshing the model? Oh, it turns out that Mistral, this French company, and Aleph Alpha in Germany started creating models as well. This is a race of a model that encapsulates humanity's knowledge. So businesses are struggling between an object which is extremely biased, based on data that they don't know where it's coming from. So there's a liability component. And then there's this thing which means that we're heading towards something which is unknown, this AGI, that may actually disrupt all jobs. So companies are lost. They are being sold surveys by McKinsey that this is the future, and they are using ChatGPT on a day-to-day basis, thinking, this is great, I don't have to work anymore, I don't have to think. So businesses are lost because they're being sold tangible future profits or efficiency at scale, and yet everyone senses, especially in Europe, that we are losing it. We are losing control of it. So what happened with DeepSeek is somewhat wonderful because it's reshuffled the cards. But maybe later on we'll touch on some of the potential solutions. But businesses have no choice but to go back to the usual suspects, which is the cloud providers that consolidate services in the stack. Microsoft Office being everywhere, you have Copilot, and so on and so forth. Or they can go the high road, which means investing a lot. It's not their job to build such software within their infrastructure. So they are struggling because they don't know where it's heading. It's complicated. It threatens the organization of white-collar jobs down the line. So they're coping. And I would say that the AI Act is a much needed regulation, but that's not where companies are panicking at all.
So, Lucie, if I could come to you next, since Hugging Face would have a somewhat overview of many projects and many companies that are interested in this topic. But just before I come to you, I would mention, so the AI Act has been finished by Parliament and has been published. It's officially in existence, but the obligations that carry fines are not applicable quite yet. They will become applicable now during the course of this year and some in later years. But so we're not yet living in the world where these things are causing people to get fines, but that time is coming soon. So we're still in the preparation phase. Lucie, would you also say that people are panicking and are worried, or how do you think readiness for the upcoming regulation is progressing?
Okay, there's a lot of points I would like to comment on. I'll start with Jan's comments on, I think, Llama. I think I work my way towards the panicking of the developer side. So I come from a very technical background, from a research perspective, and I think that we have to always consider when we think about like unleashing models, that when we do give access to open models, it helps us because we can understand what are the fallacies. Like we have researcher access, which with completely closed systems, we don't know how they behave because there is no researcher access. People will be blocked if they ask the wrong questions, if they try to like test the model's guardrails and so on. So I think there's an importance, a crucial importance of models being very open and accessible to the communities. Going backwards now towards like, what does the regulation mean for the open source community? There is, I think less of a panic and more of a curiosity what it actually will mean. What we can see across the open model developers, especially the smaller ones that we have on the platform, is that there's a certain insecurity of what that will technically mean. A lot of the people who develop, especially the smaller models or smaller developer groups, they don't have a legal team, right? They don't have anyone to read the EU AI Act and tell them what is happening. So I think documents like the Code of Practice are really crucial, and it's really crucial to make it very clear what should be done explicitly in a language that developers understand, give them templates, give them checklists, because we do see, especially in the open source community, very much good faith. Like, people do want to follow rules, they do want to develop good open source AI, they want to contribute to each other's projects. There's, like, I looked at the reporting inside Hugging Face, there's like content moderation inside the community where people flag each other things, and it's just resolved in the community. As we know it from many other open source projects, it's the same in the AI community. And I think there are a lot of things that the EU AI Act can learn from looking at the open source AI development community. There's been a long tradition of documenting models and data sets for reuse, but also around the questions of bias, societal impact, what does that mean for AI models? And I think this kind of like upcoming and becoming stronger interdisciplinary collaborations of like people talking to each other and asking, what does risk mean for a model? What means societal impact in the context of an AI model is really needed, because it was for the longest time computer scientists kind of guessing what that means, right? And yeah, as a computer scientist, maybe not the best setup. And so on Hugging Face itself, there's also experiments with like the questions of how to opt out from data sets, from training data sets. I think that's really crucial. If I'm an artist and I don't want my content to be in, or a programmer and I don't want my programming code to be as part of training data in AI models, we have seen experiments coming from the community, both, and coming from Hugging Face itself, to see what that looks like. And I think learning from each other here would be crucial to support an environment in Europe where open source development is something that we stay strong in, because we've been always strong in open source development, and it helps a lot improving and creating better models.
So Lucy mentioned the Code of Practice. So the Code of Practice is a set of guidelines that will be written by a group led by the European Commission. And so this is to help people comply with the AI Act until the standards are written, but that's a separate topic that you heard about this morning. But the drafting of the Code of Practice is being coordinated by the European Commission's AI office. So Alexandra, would you be able to tell the audience a bit about that? And also, having published the AI Act and now seeing how the people of the integrators and the implementers, how they react to the Code of Practice, is that the response the European Commission was expecting, or how do you see people reacting to the new regulation?
Yeah, thank you. So the Code of Practice is indeed a process. So it's a multi-stakeholder process for more than 1,000 stakeholders that the AI office is coordinating. So, and the chairs are writing the code. So it's like experts from their like respective field, from copyright to systemic risk assessment, mitigation, governance, that are the one writing the code, and we're helping the AI office, the commission is helping with the process. And it has been very interesting to see like all those inputs coming from like many stakeholders to engage very deeply with the legal text. And I think it's a really interesting like point of convergence between like developers, non-profit organization, right holder organizations that are coming together and try to iterate on this text. So we are currently at the second draft has been published, and we are working towards the third draft. And the fourth draft will be the final one. Until then, like the commission has to decide whether we endorse the Code of Practice or not. So that's the overview of the process. And in terms of what was expected from the reaction from the different stakeholders. I think the first thing we've been surprised, like how much engagement there was, which was really, really positive for us, because the more engagement, the more like different point of view we can like incorporate in this code and really be, as you said, like just this streamlined process to make, especially the small providers, like comply without having to hire like a legal team for that. That's exactly what we want. And then in terms of content, we've been like discussing on like some points, for instance, on like the question of risk assessment, which is crucial. Like that, some of the obligation for models that are above a certain threshold is to assess and mitigate systemic risk. And here, I think we've been also like seeing a lot of engagement on like what kind of risk should we include or not in the taxonomy that the code of practice is proposing. And here, the discussion have been particularly interesting. Yeah.
And then, Alexandra, you are involved in a project on Eurostack. And so this is not specifically an AI project, but it's a project to create a set of software packages that would be available to governments to provide digital services. I hope that's not too rough a summary. But could that be used then as a way to help the public sector to adopt the right kinds of AI, and do we even know what process to use to define that?
Well, hopefully. Maybe first of all, Eurostack, it's not so much about services as it is about infrastructure. I think Jan already mentioned that. What we really lack in Europe is our own infrastructure, because all the products run on cloud storage, on data centers, which are 70, 80, 90% controlled by US companies. We see Chinese competitors coming in. And when I talk to the big European cloud companies, they are losing market share, although this is a market that is growing very, very quickly, and they tell me, oh, we are not sure whether we can survive the next 3 or 4 years. So that is a very, very serious issue. And the idea of Eurostack is we are seeing authoritarian governments all over the world. We know that digital technology can be used to democratize in an incredibly positive way, but the way it is controlled now, it is the hugest power concentration, power and wealth concentration the world has ever seen. We have all seen, I said that last night as well, we have seen the tech oligarchs standing behind President Trump. So you don't only have the digital power concentration, the economic power concentration, but now it also goes together hand in hand with the power of the most powerful government in the world, the US administration. So this leaves us with the question, where does Europe stand and where does Europe want to stand? And we know that data that is stored by a US company, even on European soil, the American government has access to this. And the American government, they used to be partners and friends in a Western liberal democratic world. I think the last weeks and months have shed a few doubts about the fact that this government is friendly towards us and sees us really as a partner. So let's see how it goes. But in the meantime, I think it's a very good idea to be able to guarantee our own sovereignty in different areas. And the technological area is certainly right now the most important one. So how can we do that? Looking at infrastructure, first of all, we have been discussing a lot social networks regulation, which is where I come from in the past weeks. But that hides a little bit the fact that the same issue we have with moderation policy and social networks we have with large language models. Lucy just alluded to that. And to just give you an example, when Mark Zuckerberg now says, well, you can't discriminate against people because they have mental health issues. You can't mention that, you can't insult them. Unless they're queer. That is breaching European fundamental rights. But in a large language model, you have exactly the same issues, but you don't have the moderation policy that, according to DSA, has to be transparent and out in the open for a large language model. You don't have that. And that is the question that people started discussing in the past day with DeepSeek, which doesn't answer the question, what happened in Tiananmen? So we need that kind of transparency. So we need some kind of openness for artificial intelligence. We're never going to have that if we're just base our own technology on US or Chinese models. But first of all, we need to build the infrastructure. And this is where I think really we need European leadership. We need the European Commission, which is going to come up with the Cloud and AI Innovation Act, I hope by the end of next year, maybe 2026, to really signal the European Commission believes in Europe, believes in European industry, and believes in a digital European infrastructure that gives entrepreneurs in Europe, businesses, startups, really the possibility to have something to build on. I think that's the first point. The second point that then comes in is procurement, public procurement. We need lead markets. I think what startup with businesses want is not so much public funding, they want customers, paying customers. And this is where public authorities come in, because that's an enormous market in Europe. And public authorities should be very careful who they give their citizens' data to. So we know we have data protection issues there, that's very personal data. And it should run in European data centers and with European products, and especially when they start using artificial intelligence, they have to make sure, even more than any private company, a public authority needs to make sure the models they're using are not biased. They can look into them, they really know what's in there, what kind of decisions do these models take. So that becomes really a very primary concern, and this is why I think we should use the Public Procurement Directive, which will be reopened in the next month, to really make sure that public authorities use European products, or at least products that really comply completely with GDPR, that comply completely with the AI Act, and that guarantee the kind of transparency that we need to keep our citizens safe.
There's two parts to that answer that I'd like to dig into a little bit more. And so one is on creating markets and keeping businesses in Europe, because our regulations work most effectively when we're actually developing it here. I'll ask Jan about that in a minute. But first I want to just ask Lucie, on the geopolitical thing, it seems that people talk about American AI and European AI and Chinese AI, but on the Hugging Face platform, you try to encourage collaboration. And do you see individual projects staying in silos, or is the openness actually causing people to collaborate on other models? And is there a correlation between things that are more open attract more contributors and more collaboration? No? Do you see any trends there? Oh, no.
Yeah, okay. So I definitely would say more openness attracts more collaboration. That's very simple and straightforward. It also means that more downstream users will use the model, because it's much easier to test and play around with a model that you just simply don't pay for, compared to one where you have to pay. Testing stuff on your own infrastructure is a lot easier. And testing therefore also means you find errors and report the errors, or you sit down and actually try to fix them. So there is a lot more collaboration. But I think one of the projects Hugging Face was involved in that I want to exemplify is this Bloom project, which is now the largest open source multilingual language model. And why I like this project a lot is because it exemplifies what it means to foster collaboration and innovation in an open source context. So naturally collaboration exists, but also putting kind of the money into it and the care for it, bringing different institutions and researchers together, as well as like smaller companies, to work together towards European-led language models really makes a huge difference. And I think seeing that for a different perspective on DeepSeek, smaller models can now reach competitive performance is really, really a good look on how we in Europe can develop models from here on, saying maybe we don't need as much resources, maybe it's also more sustainable and environmental friendly to use a little bit less of the compute, but also makes us a lot more competitive again and makes us able to look into, exactly as I said, what happens if we foster collaboration and open source projects.
And then if I can go to Jan to ask about the economic or the path towards making a European market that allows European businesses to continue to be profitable and to thrive, and for people to choose Europe as a place to do open source and free software AI.
So this is where I make my plea to the policymakers that you are here. My plea is to do openness as policy in a broad sense. So we talked about the infrastructure, we talked about the models. We've seen what happens in the competition between models that are ranked thanks to Hugging Face. So Hugging Face is an agent of fluidification and competitivity. Now, this thing is organic, but does not benefit Europe as of yet. So I'm going to unpack openness as a term, but the first thing we need to do, and this was highlighted this morning in the opening keynote and the first panel, Europe is behind. But if I want to be strictly honest with you, my thinking is that Europe is in the same position as Africa, pre-adoption of mobile technology. In other words, we've not invested enough in infrastructure, digital infrastructure, for the past 3 decades. As a result, we are unable to catch up on that front. So the question is, what do we do as Europeans to do the quantum leap that is required for us to be part of the conversation around AI, but society after all? And when we talk about, shall I say, protectionism, the one thing that we should talk about is protecting our European values. And yet, Europe is struggling because actually some people desire Europe to be broken up. Now, if we are feeling strong about what Europe means in terms of values, we should build towards that. So that's why the policy should not be taken in silos, but they should be taken as a project. So to me, openness as a policy is something that resolves the protection of our values by leaning on the fundamental pillars of open source, typically. But I hate that word associated with AI because it is a system. So I know Stephane's job is to define it, and he has a big job, and we need to support him with, our feedback so that we get it right. But it's not so much about the definition as far as I'm concerned, it's about how we leverage the pillars. Now, openness is a combination of open standards, open science, open data, open source, open models, and shared infrastructure, because there's a cost component with the infrastructure. But the rest is fairly light, almost like knowledge. In fact, as Europeans, we should reignite our desire for knowledge and science. Renaissance was basically the end of dogmas and the emergence of science. How about we go back to that simply? So openness as a policy reignites those values, reignites our ability to open the hood and say, I want to see how it works inside it. Right? And to me, this is my personal point of view, but my thinking goes as follows. If we do change the European software in terms of where we want to be, then this is what we should demand. So we should require more open data, more open source, so that we end up weaponizing, which is what China is doing, we end up weaponizing. That's an offensive move, not a defensive move. In fact, the AI Act is quite defensive because we saw it coming and we're like, whoa, this is big. Let's say what should be done, what should be right. But that's not the end goal. The AI Act is a means to an end. The end is to be protective of European values because you know what? We're not the United States of America. And we're not China either. And there's nothing wrong with either model. Right? They exist on their own. But as Europeans, we are what we have been for the past 75 years. In fact, the US saved us from ourselves. That's a good thing, right? But we are democracies, so we should be sparring partner. The US is not seeing it like that today. So we are the junior partner. We should raise to the challenge by saying, we are Europeans, and we care for values, so therefore we care for citizens first. We care for certain fundamental rights, GDPR being one of them. So it's a nasty pop-up. Maybe you can fix that. But basically, there's a fundamental end. It's not the means. The means is almost irrelevant. And if we don't go back to that fundamental end, we get nowhere. So adopting openness as a policy means we start fighting all around for more openness. Sometimes the data is closed because it's proprietary, it's sensitive. That's okay. But we need to understand how the system works. We need to be demanding. Meta can open source, quote unquote, whatever they want. Maybe in Europe we're not okay with that because they are not disclosing the data. They actually stole it from us. So we should be demanding. We should not accept the default situation and rewrite the European software using and actually just borrowing what works in open source. Borrowing this notion of ultimate collaboration that actually leads to commons, public good. And it turns out that some of the numbers that the EU is publishing are quite hard to harness. I think it's 1 billion in investment in open source leads to 60 plus billion, 90 billion in return. Now you can't pinpoint it, but that's okay. Governments don't have to pinpoint. They have to generate possibilities for their citizens, right? And subsidies don't work. They just don't work.
Alexandra, would you like to reply to that?
No, I would, if I may, I would have a question and a comment, and I totally subscribe to everything you said, and I would like to take up that last aspect as well, because one question that has never been asked when you listen to the Googles and the Metas and the OpenAI of this was, where does the added value go? You know, because they tell us, oh, it's going to be great for your productivity, and you know, in my home state, a lot of big companies are adopting their products, and they don't really ask the question, where does the money go? Where does the added value go? You know, and I'm not telling you a secret, it doesn't stay in Europe. So the more we adopt these products, and productivity means less white-collar jobs in the end, you know, once these things really work well. That's the point. That's what they're trying to say when they say productivity. We know these companies don't pay taxes in Europe, basically, simplifying a little bit, but, you know, compared to a classical industrial or service company, they basically don't pay taxes. And we don't have the people working there anymore who don't pay taxes because they have a labor density that is a lot less, you know, a lot less people work there per million of profit. So where does the money come from? The citizen, for the services that our citizens are used to and that we want to keep, you know, health, schools. If you go to the US, that's a different quality of life, you know, and it's not better, it's worse, frankly, because the money is not there anymore. So I think making that economic argument of added value, staying in Europe for European citizens, for European businesses, but also for state budgets to give services to their citizens, I think that's a very important point that rarely comes up in these discussions. That's one. Then I have a question back to you. I totally subscribe to everything you said about openness. And then you said the magic word protectionism. The problem with open data is that it usually benefits especially the companies with the big infrastructure to use that kind of data. So how do we solve this contradiction as policymakers? I found that's always a difficult question for me.
There is this misconceived idea that once we open something, our competitors benefit from it. The thing is, knowledge is a non-rival good. It actually benefits you first, because for every bit of non-rival good, you prevent people from buying a commercial solution that comes from outside that is more competitive. Now, of course, certain pockets of data, certain aspects and certain assets need to be protected. That's okay. We're not saying that we should end closeness or we should end proprietary systems. They're fine. And by the way, Microsoft is fine and Google is fine. They're good companies, good products. But the market is growing, so there's no reason we should think we should be on par or catch up. And so to me, for every bit of openness, we lower the ceiling of strategic dependency. In fact, do you know how to measure sovereignty, digital sovereignty? Probably not, because it's extremely hard and abstract. Sovereignty is a term anchored in military terms, nationwide. Europe is not a nation, it's a superstructure. So digital sovereignty actually is super hard to grasp at the European level. Let's talk about strategic autonomy. It's a better word. If you measure the amount of technology needed per nation or per superstructure, let's say Europe, over the quantity of digital technology sold, you end up with a number. France is 1%. So the strategic autonomy for digital in France is 1%, close to zero. The goal should be 3%, because 3% is our relative GDP for France. Europe is what, 18% relative GDP? So in Europe, we should be consuming 18% of technology based on our needs internally. The point is we are actually below 5. Why? Because, again, infrastructure, which is consolidating. AI is consolidating in big tech. AWS with Anthropic, Google with Google with its some things, Gemini, and then you have Microsoft with OpenAI. So all of that is consolidated there. So this strategic autonomy, we need to build it, and the point is we need to reverse the trend, right? So it is a mindset more than an actual regulation. It's a policy that stems from saying we need to be able to look under the hood so that we protect our values. That's it. It's the right to inspect. The right to inspect. Maybe Meta says we have an open source model, we want to unleash it in Europe. Maybe the Commission can require to look at it. Show us the data. They won't do it, but
well,
you're saying, look, maybe we should.
We could ask them. No, I'm not going to put you on the spot like that. But yeah, so Alexandra, I did notice you were taking notes during the discussion, so would you like to reply to some of the
Yeah, first
topics?
maybe to this question, can we look at the data? Like, theoretically we can. Like the AI office has the power to request information for providers of general purpose AI that are placed on the market in the Union. Of course, that's a legal process. We need like some reasons to do it. But yeah, that's the idea behind the AI office, is to have like a body that can do this kind of thing. Yes, I was taking some notes, and I think first to go back to maybe your opening intervention, like you said, the AI Act is not the reason why companies are lost and feel like they have to cope. I'm like very happy to hear that, and in fact, we'd like the AI Act to be a reason for companies maybe to provide a framework for them to like guide them in terms of like doing documentation, as like it worked really well with Hugging Face and unleashing this idea of openness, and so not creating additional burden, far from that, but trying to canalize and standardize, like take this opportunity to have like all those people coming together and talking about the same text. I think it's quite wonderful, and this could go into this idea of open standard, as you also said, and going beyond just the openness of the artifact itself. And as far also I wanted to have a shout out to the initiative of trying to replicate DeepSeek. I know Hugging Face started that, because DeepSeek, as you said, is like just unleashed in the EU, not fully open. There's like a lot of details that the provider did not give, and I think Hugging Face tries to fill this hole. And I see this as really like this opportunity, maybe building on that and like other effort to like start to believe that yes, we can do something in the EU and fill this gap and be fully open and try to like lead the way in this direction. Yeah, so my message to share.
And Lucie, I was going to ask you then a question, but I saw you were also taking notes. Would you like to reply to?
I think a lot of what you said makes very much sense. Like, I think there's a lot of questions around, like, how do we encourage more? So there's the one question around the policy, of course, like how do we make policy in a way that supports developers in the EU? But then I think there's also the larger question, which is this, like, unsatisfying feeling of like, what is that gap? Why do we not have more people working on AI in the EU? And I mean, I might be biased, but I do think that, as I said before, pushing towards projects where a larger community can collaborate plays to the strengths of the EU, especially because it's a place that is not a monolith. We have a lot of countries coming together with a lot of different perspectives, and I think that having that reflected in the development of AI is something that we can play to great strengths with. So then the other aspect is the lack of infrastructure, where we can say, like, okay, we have those models now becoming competitive. We have Hugging Face developed a model called Small LLM, which is a very, very small language model that already can be run even on the clusters of universities in Europe. To be able to build something on top of this, all of that is completely open source. And then the same with, exactly as you said, DeepSeek, where our science team is reproducing that, again, completely open source, saying, what if we can actually look at the model and the data set that it was trained in, speak about the architecture of how we can create those models, and then make it available and accessible, again, to researchers and developers. And I think those initiatives are crucial because this will lead us not only to catch up on the model development part, but also on how do we deploy those models, and do we understand what kind of data they were trained on? Do they fit into our framework and understanding of how a model in Europe should be deployed, in what context it should be deployed?
I had 3 questions left. Now, we're down to 10 minutes, as you can see on the screen in front of you, so I'll ask you to try and keep it to 3 minutes approximately. But Lucie, to stay with you, the trends you see, do you see a push in the direction of people going more open or more restricted? And do you think that regulation is something that impacts people's decision to do one or the other?
Okay, that's 2 aspects. So we now on Hugging Face have over 1 million models, and we see it constantly growing, and I think that's a really good sign. We try to also make it easier for a variety of developers, so not just a classical machine learning, computer science background, to contribute to the models and data sets. That's going really good, and I think there is this push towards openness of AI development, and there always has been. Like, I think we sometimes forget, because there has been this like big splash of OpenAI and ChatGPT, that the big advances in AI have always been in the open, and I strongly believe they will stay in the open, and they necessarily have to, because it's not like one mastermind who creates AI, but it's a process of many trial and errors. Sorry, the second part? Oh, the policy part, right, sorry. And so, on the other hand, I think there is a lot of requests that I have for the policy and the code of practice, and that is to think about the transparency of closed models. Like, I think it's really, really crucial to think about how transparent the closed model providers, for example, have to be about data sets. And I know you don't want to talk about copyright, so I'm going to keep that very short. But I think that it's really important that closed model providers have to report on their training data in enough detail that copyright holders, but also privacy advocates, can understand what kind of data is in those data sets, so that we don't accidentally create a situation where, if I put my data openly available, I have always the fear of being sued because, you know, I scrape data and I know, thank you, and I might not be the I might not have everything, but it's really, really important to not disincentivize open sharing of data, and therefore we need to have transparency on the big closed source providers. Thank you.
Maybe to react directly, of like, so the React has this template of like, it's now mandated by the law that like this template needs to be created. So yeah, and like the code of practice is laying down the detail of that, I think, in part of it at least, yeah. Yeah,
make it transparent, make it good. I'm trusting you guys that you enable Europe to be competitive.
Okay, so I'm going to try and leave 2 minutes at the end so you can all make a closing statement, which would be 2 sentences maximum. But the last question I'd like to pose to Alexandra is that a lot of the people here in this room are interested and concerned about policy, and they sometimes feel that free and open source software isn't taken into account during the legislative process. And so I'd like to ask, what's the best way to get involved, or what advice would you give? And to be a little bit specific, I mean, rather than people being frustrated and complaining, how can they fulfill a need that you have in terms of needing to know more information about the technical aspects or the business models or proof of harms that could happen? What's the information that people could provide that would be most useful, that's most lacking for people who have the difficult job of trying to write legislation that covers so many topics?
That's a great question. I think it's not so much about what kind of information you provide. I mean, policymakers will ask you stupid questions. It's about doing it. You know, I get I'm a member of the European Parliament. I get a request for meetings like at least 1 or 2 times a week from some kind of big tech company, association, trade association, consultancy representing them. You know, they come in different shapes and forms. If you read like lobby control reports about the lobbying of big tech, I don't need to explain to you. That means, I'm a person who cares about citizens' right and about open source, so I choose my meetings very carefully. And I ask to meet other people, also open source advocates. And so I get a balanced information. That is not true for most of my colleagues. You know, they will just choose from the meeting requests they get. And if they get very insistent meeting requests, always from more or less the same set of interests, maybe not the same set of people, but the same set of interests, that is who they will listen to. So my advice, and I know, I mean, it's an enormous amount of money involved, so they can pay an enormous amount of people, of very well-paid and very highly qualified people to come and talk to us, and that's hard to compete with. But find ways to come and look for us, you know, as organizations, forum, team up together, organize a group of entrepreneurs, startup who work with open source from the country where that member of parliament comes from. You know, if 6, 7 businesses organize, they come to Brussels and they ask for a meeting and they organize beforehand, people are incentivized to listen and to receive them. Invite them to see your companies or your universities, what they're doing. You know, really reach out to politicians. This is what big tech is doing, and this is one of the reasons why they're so powerful, because they're doing that really, really well, I have to admit. So I think that is my best advice. The other one is obviously inviting us on panels like you did here, but you know, not only those who are sympathetic and who already advocating exactly for the main cause, but invite also people who are very skeptical or very close to big tech to have a controversial discussion. I think that's interesting. Showing them examples of where open source is and what kind of products, because most people don't realize, you know. Show them how you can make money on it, because many, especially more conservative and more, you know, politicians more close to businesses, they think open source, well, that's something, you know, people do in their free time in a garage or something. So showing them what the business side of it is, what the revenue side of it is, how it drives innovation. I think that is super important. So I think it's not so much about the message, you know, you get the questions. It's about reaching out. I think that is super important. And try to be present in every conversation. And, you know, when there are panels organized in parliament or outside parliament where their politicians go, sit in the audience, and when there's time to ask a question, come up afterwards and tell, you know, I have this great project, or have you ever heard about open source, can I come and see you? Just really reach out. That is what they do, and they're extremely successful in doing it.
My colleague is waving a white flag at the back of the room. We don't have time for a closing statement, but I don't feel too bad, because I have a slight feeling that we're going to be talking about this for another 5 years, maybe more. So I really want to thank Jan as well, very important. Thank you for mentioning that we should all participate in the OSI procedure and think about what we want in this discussion. And thank you very much to the guests. I think that was a fantastic discussion, and thank you everyone here who stayed for the big event. Thank you very much.